Deep in the heart of rural Alabama, where the year 1880 found civilization clinging to the edges of vast wilderness, there existed a place that decent folk learned never to mention by name. The pinewoods stretched for miles in every direction, their towering trunks creating a cathedral of shadows that seemed to swallow sound itself. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient branches, and the air hung thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water from the cypress swamps that bordered the forest on three sides. It was here, in this forgotten corner of the world, that something lived which challenged every assumption the local people held about the nature of humanity itself. The nearest settlement, a collection of weathered buildings that called itself Millbrook, sat nearly 10 miles from the edge of the pine thicket. But even at that distance, the presence in the woods made itself felt in ways that rational minds struggled to explain. Conversations would die mid-sentence when the wind shifted from that direction, bringing with it scents that reminded people of things they preferred not to think about. Children would wake crying from dreams they could not describe, and even the boldest hunters would find excuses to avoid the trails that led too deep into those dark places between the trees. The isolation was so complete that maps from the period showed nothing but blank space where the pinewoods lay, as if cartographers had decided that some territories were better left unexplored and unmarked. The few roads that approached the area would peter out into deer paths and game trails, discouraging all but the most determined travelers from venturing further into the green twilight that seemed to exist perpetually beneath the forest canopy. Those who did enter the woods reported an oppressive silence that felt unnatural, as if the normal sounds of wildlife had been systematically eliminated, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant splash of something moving through the hidden swamps. But it was not the isolation itself that made the local people speak in hushed tones whenever the subject arose in conversation. It was the knowledge, passed down through generations of whispered warnings and half-remembered stories, that they were not alone in that wilderness. Somewhere deep within the pine thicket, in a clearing that no respectable person had ever seen and lived to describe accurately, stood a collection of ramshackle buildings that housed a family whose very existence seemed to violate the natural order of creation. The structures themselves were visible only to those unlucky enough to stumble upon them by accident or misfortune. Travelers who had lost their way in the woods described catching glimpses of sagging rooflines and tilting walls through breaks in the trees, buildings that appeared to have been constructed from whatever materials could be scavenged from the forest floor. The wood was gray with age and moisture, covered in moss and vines that seemed to be slowly reclaiming the structures for the wilderness. Windows, where they existed at all, were covered with oiled paper or animal hides, creating an impression that the inhabitants preferred to keep the outside world at bay while hiding whatever activities occurred within their makeshift walls. But it was the fleeting glimpses of the family members themselves that truly haunted those who encountered them, children with features that seemed somehow wrong, as if human faces had been assembled according to rules that no one had ever taught them. Adults who moved through the shadows between the trees with a peculiar gait that suggested they were more comfortable in darkness than in daylight. Voices that carried oddly through the still air, speaking words that sounded like English but followed patterns of speech that hurt the ears and made listeners feel dizzy and confused. The few brave souls, who had ventured close enough to observe the family's daily activities, reported scenes that challenged their understanding of civilized behavior. They spoke of seeing figures engaged in activities that seemed to follow no purpose that normal minds could grasp, moving in and out of their ramshackle buildings according to schedules that bore no relationship to the rhythms of sunrise and sunset that governed the lives of ordinary people. Most disturbing were the accounts of children playing games that involved no laughter, no joy, and no sounds that could be recognized as the natural expressions of youthful energy and curiosity. The local preacher, Reverend Samuel Hayes of the Millbrook Baptist Church, had attempted on several occasions to organize missions to bring Christian salvation to whatever souls might be living in the pine woods. But these efforts had invariably failed before they could begin. Volunteers who expressed initial enthusiasm for the project would find themselves overcome by inexplicable dread as the departure date approached, canceling their participation with vague explanations about family obligations or sudden illness. Those few who had actually entered the woods with evangelical intentions had returned with thousand-yard stares and a complete refusal to discuss what they had encountered in the darkness beneath the trees. The local doctor, a practical man named William Garrison, who had served the community for nearly 20 years, maintained official skepticism about the stories that circulated through Millbrook like a persistent fever. But even Dr. Garrison would admit, when pressed by close friends, and after sufficient whiskey had been consumed, that there were aspects of the situation that troubled his scientific sensibilities. The complete absence of any medical emergencies or requests for assistance from the pinewoods was itself an anomaly that suggested either perfect health or perfect isolation from the normal accidents and illnesses that affected all human communities. As the summer of 1880 deepened and the heat began to make even the shadows oppressive, the whispers in Millbrook grew more frequent and more urgent. Something was changing in the pinewoods, people said, though no one could articulate exactly what that change might be or how they had become aware of it. The very air seemed to carry a tension that made sleep difficult and dreams unpleasant, and sensitive individuals reported feeling watched whenever they ventured too close to the tree line that marked the boundary between civilization and whatever lay beyond. But who were they really, these phantom residents of the Alabama wilderness? And why did even the bravest souls in Millbrook find themselves unable to speak their name aloud when darkness fell and the pine woods seemed to lean closer to the edges of town? The answers to those whispered questions lay buried in stories that the oldest residents of Millbrook carried like scars, tales passed down through generations with the kind of reluctant precision that marked truly traumatic memories. According to these fragmented accounts, the family in the pine woods could trace their presence in the area back to the earliest days of settlement, when Alabama was still a territory, and the boundaries between civilization and wilderness were measured in courage rather than miles. The original patriarch, if the stories could be believed, had been a man named Ezekiel Hollow, who had arrived in the region sometime in the 1820s with a pregnant wife and a wagon full of possessions that suggested he was fleeing from something more serious than mere economic hardship. Local records from that period were sparse and contradictory, but what documentation existed painted a picture of a man who seemed determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever life he had abandoned in the civilized world. Ezekiel had claimed the land in the pine woods through a combination of legal maneuvers and simple occupation, establishing his homestead in a location so remote that territorial authorities were content to ignore his presence rather than attempt to enforce building codes or tax collection in such an inaccessible area. His wife, whose name appeared in some records as Martha and in others as Mary, had given birth to their first child in that isolated clearing, beginning a family line that would continue for generations without any meaningful contact with the outside world. But it was the nature of that continuation that transformed ordinary frontier isolation into something far more disturbing. Cut off from normal social interactions and marriage prospects, the Hollow family had apparently chosen to preserve their bloodline through unions that violated every law of church and state. Brother married sister, father took daughter, and the genetic consequences of these forbidden relationships began to manifest in ways that challenged the very definition of human appearance and behavior. Thomas Whitaker, now in his 70s and one of the few remaining residents who claimed to have actually seen members of the Hollow family, would describe his encounter in a voice that never rose above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow summon the creatures he remembered. He had been hunting deer in the outer edges of the pine woods as a young man, he said, when he had come upon a clearing where several children were engaged in what might charitably be called play, though their activities bore little resemblance to any games that normal children might enjoy. The youngsters, he recalled, had skin so pale it seemed almost transparent, revealing the blue network of veins that carried blood through their malformed bodies. Their faces were wrong in ways that Whitaker struggled to articulate even decades later, with features that seemed to have been assembled according to some alien blueprint that approximated human appearance without truly understanding its underlying principles. Some had eyes that were too large for their skulls, while others possessed mouths that seemed to contain too many teeth, or teeth that were shaped like those of animals rather than humans. Most disturbing of all was their movement, which Whitaker described as simultaneously too fluid and too angular, as if their joints bent in directions that human anatomy should not have permitted. They communicated with each other through sounds that incorporated elements of human speech, but included whistles, clicks, and harmonics, that reminded him more of bird calls or insect noises than of any language that rational beings might employ. Sarah Coleman, the midwife who had served the Millbrook area for nearly 40 years, possessed knowledge that she shared only with her closest confidants, and only after extracting solemn promises that her words would never be repeated outside the circle of trust. She had been called upon twice in her career to assist with births in the pinewoods, she claimed, summoned by desperate messengers who appeared at her door in the middle of the night with offers of payment that far exceeded her normal fees. The birth she had witnessed, according to her carefully guarded testimony, had produced infants that challenged every assumption she had developed about the process of human reproduction. Some of the babies possessed physical characteristics that seemed to represent evolutionary steps backward, rather than forward, with bone structures that reminded her of medical illustrations she had seen depicting primitive human ancestors. Others displayed what could only be described as evolutionary advances, with sensory organs that appeared to be more highly developed than those of normal children and nervous systems that seemed to process information in ways that exceeded normal human capabilities. Most troubling were her observations about the family's response to these unusual births. Rather than showing the concern or distress that normal parents might display when confronted with children who deviated so dramatically from expected norms, the Hollow family members seemed to view these variations as natural and even desirable developments. They spoke of their offspring's unusual characteristics with a pride that suggested they believed they were participating in some form of guided evolution that would eventually produce beings superior to ordinary humanity. The voices of the Hollow family members, according to those few witnesses who had heard them speak, carried qualities that made normal conversation impossible. Some individuals seemed to possess vocal cords that could produce sounds far outside the normal range of human speech, creating harmonics and overtones that caused listeners to experience physical discomfort and psychological distress. Others spoke in whispers so soft that their words seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the bones and organs of those who heard them. Dr. Margaret Foster, a traveling physician who had attempted to establish a practice in the region during the 1870s, had made detailed notes about what she referred to as the acoustic anomalies associated with the Hollow family. Her journal entries, discovered years later among her effects, described voices that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, making it impossible to locate the speaker, even when the listener was certain they were engaged in face-to-face conversation. She theorized that the family's unusual vocal characteristics might be related to physical modifications in their throat and chest cavities, adaptations that had developed over generations of isolation and interbreeding. But Dr. Foster's investigations had come to an abrupt end when she announced her intention to conduct a comprehensive medical examination of the entire Hollow family, an ambitious project that she believed would revolutionize the understanding of human genetic variation and adaptation. Her last journal entry, dated September 15, 1875, expressed confidence that her research would soon provide answers to questions about human evolution that had puzzled scientists for decades, but no trace of Dr. Foster was ever found after that date, and her ambitious medical project vanished along with the woman who had conceived it. As word of the Hollow family's disturbing characteristics spread beyond the immediate vicinity of Millbrook, the pinewoods began to attract a different kind of visitor, travelers drawn by morbid curiosity, scientists seeking to study genetic anomalies, and adventurers who viewed the mysterious family as a challenge to be conquered rather than a danger to be avoided. These outsiders, arriving with their city clothes and confident attitudes, would typically spend a night or two in Millbrook, gathering information and supplies before venturing into the forest that the locals had learned to fear. What happened to many of these visitors became the subject of stories that were even more disturbing than the accounts of the Hollow family themselves. The first documented case involved a journalist named Harrison Blake, who had traveled from Atlanta in the spring of 1878 with the intention of writing a sensational article about what he called the degenerates of the Alabama wilderness for a national magazine that specialized in tales of frontier life and unusual phenomena. Blake had arrived in Millbrook with all the confidence of a man who had covered wars and natural disasters, dismissing the locals' warnings as the products of ignorance and superstition. He spent 3 days interviewing residents and collecting what he described in letters to his editor as colorful folklore that will make excellent copy once I separate the truth from the embellishments that rural people inevitably add to their stories. His plan was to spend several days in the pinewoods documenting the Hollow family's living conditions and conducting interviews that would provide the factual foundation for his article. Blake's letters home stopped abruptly after his departure for the pinewoods, but his fate remained unknown until his horse returned to Millbrook 3 weeks later, wandering into town with its saddle still in place, but showing signs of having survived on its own in the wilderness for an extended period. A search party found Blake's campsite in a clearing about 5 miles into the forest, with his tent still standing and his equipment scattered around the area as if he had abandoned his camp in great haste. Most puzzling was the condition of Blake's notebooks, which were found scattered throughout the campsite with pages torn out, and the remaining entries rendered illegible by what appeared to be deliberate defacement. The few words that could still be read suggested that Blake had encountered something in the woods that had challenged his skeptical worldview, with fragmentary phrases like, "not human after all," and "should never have come here," visible among the damaged pages. The pattern established by Blake's disappearance was repeated with disturbing regularity over the following years. Marcus Vance, a photographer from New Orleans who had hoped to capture images of the Hollow family for a book about unusual American communities, vanished after spending 2 nights in the pine woods, leaving behind only his camera equipment, which was found smashed and scattered across a half-mile radius, as if it had been destroyed by beings with superhuman strength and a particular hatred of mechanical devices. Dr. Edmund Carlisle, a professor of anthropology from the University of Alabama, who had organized a scientific expedition to study what he believed might be a surviving population of primitive humans, disappeared, along with 2 graduate students and a local guide, after establishing a base camp near the edge of the pine woods. Their camp was found weeks later, but in a condition that suggested it had been systematically dismantled and rearranged, according to some alien sense of organization that left investigators baffled and disturbed. But it was the fate of Samuel Hutchins, a traveling merchant who had been making regular circuits through rural Alabama for over 20 years, that provided the most chilling evidence of what might be happening to visitors who ventured too close to the Hollow family's domain. Hutchins had been known throughout the region for his reliability and his practical approach to business, never allowing superstition or local folklore to interfere with his established routes and schedules. When Hutchins failed to arrive at his scheduled stop in Millbrook during the autumn of 1879, his business partners organized a search that traced his route backward from his last confirmed location. They found his wagon 2 days later, mired in swampy ground at the edge of the pine woods with its wheels sunk deep into mud that seemed to have claimed the vehicle with unusual efficiency and permanence. The wagon's contents were intact and undisturbed, with bolts of cloth, tools, household goods, and other merchandise still carefully packed and organized, exactly as Hutchins would have arranged them. His personal belongings were present as well, including a strong box containing the profits from his recent sales and a diary that documented his travels up to the day of his disappearance. But Hutchins himself was nowhere to be found, and the search party could locate no footprints or other evidence that might indicate the direction he had taken when he abandoned his wagon. The most disturbing discovery came from Jacob Riley, a member of the search party who had wandered slightly apart from the main group while examining the area around the abandoned wagon. Riley claimed to have seen drag marks in the soft earth leading from the wagon toward the deeper parts of the pine woods, furrows in the ground that suggested something heavy had been pulled through the underbrush by beings with enough strength to move a full-grown man against his will. When Riley called the other searchers to examine his discovery, they found the drag marks exactly as he had described them, but they also found something else that made the entire search party pack up their equipment and return to Millbrook with unprecedented haste. Mixed in with the mud and vegetation that filled the furrows were fragments of clothing that matched the description of what Hutchins had been wearing when he was last seen, along with darker stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The implications of these discoveries created a level of fear in Millbrook that went far beyond the usual caution that residents displayed when discussing the Hollow family. If the mysterious inhabitants of the pine woods were indeed responsible for the disappearances of outsiders, then their activities had evolved beyond mere avoidance of contact to active predation on anyone who ventured too close to their territory. The whispered conversations in the town's general store and church gatherings began to include speculation about whether the Hollow family had always been dangerous to outsiders, or whether something had changed in their behavior that made them more aggressive and threatening than they had been in previous decades. Among the professionals who had taken notice of the disturbing reports emanating from the Alabama pine woods was Dr. Jeremiah Callaway, a physician and amateur naturalist whose practice in Montgomery had brought him into contact with a wide variety of medical conditions and genetic anomalies. Unlike the journalists and adventurers who had previously attempted to investigate the Hollow family, Dr. Callaway approached the situation with the methodical precision of a trained scientist, believing that careful observation and documentation could provide rational explanations for phenomena that ignorant rural people had interpreted through the lens of superstition and fear. Dr. Callaway's initial interest in the case had been sparked by conversations with colleagues who had heard second-hand accounts of the unusual medical conditions that allegedly affected the inhabitants of the pine woods. As a physician with a particular interest in hereditary diseases and genetic variation, he saw the Hollow family as an unprecedented opportunity to study the effects of prolonged isolation and consanguineous marriage on human development and adaptation. His approach to the investigation was characterized by the same systematic methodology that had made him one of the most respected medical practitioners in the state. Rather than rushing into the pine woods with preconceived notions about what he might find, Dr. Callaway spent several months collecting and analyzing every available account of encounters with the Hollow family, looking for patterns and consistencies that might provide clues about the true nature of their condition. The journal that Dr. Callaway maintained throughout his investigation, portions of which would eventually be recovered and preserved by local historical societies, revealed a mind struggling to reconcile scientific training with observations that challenged fundamental assumptions about human biology and behavior. His early entries reflected confidence that the mystery would yield to careful analysis, but as his research progressed, his tone became increasingly troubled and uncertain. Dr. Callaway's first direct encounter with members of the Hollow family occurred during a carefully planned expedition to the pine woods in the late summer of 1880. Unlike previous investigators who had approached the area with minimal preparation, he had spent weeks studying maps and consulting with local guides to identify the safest routes and most advantageous observation points. His equipment included the latest medical instruments, photographic apparatus, and scientific measuring devices, all carefully selected to document whatever phenomena he might encounter. The initial phase of his investigation proceeded according to plan, with Dr. Callaway establishing a base camp at what he judged to be a safe distance from the Hollow family's known territory, while still providing adequate opportunity for observation and documentation. His journal entries from this period described a methodical process of mapping the family's daily routines, noting their movement patterns, and attempting to catalog the various physical and behavioral anomalies that had been reported by previous witnesses. But it was Dr. Callaway's attempts to conduct direct medical examinations that revealed the true extent of the Hollow family's departure from normal human development. Through a combination of patient observation and careful negotiation, he had managed to arrange what he believed would be non-invasive examinations of several family members, including basic measurements, pulse and respiration monitoring, and collection of tissue samples for microscopic analysis. The results of these examinations, as recorded in Dr. Callaway's increasingly frantic journal entries, defied every principle of human anatomy and physiology that he had learned during his medical training. The family members' vital signs showed patterns that seemed to violate basic biological laws, with heart rates and breathing rhythms that varied far outside the normal range, while still somehow maintaining the subjects in apparent good health. Most disturbing were the tissue samples that Dr. Callaway collected for laboratory analysis. Under microscopic examination, the cellular structure of the Hollow family's blood, skin, and hair showed characteristics that he described as unprecedented in medical literature and possibly unprecedented in nature itself. The cells appeared to be organized according to principles that bore little resemblance to normal human tissue architecture, with organelles and structures that served functions he could not identify or understand. Dr. Callaway's journal entries from this period revealed a growing sense of unease about the implications of his discoveries. Rather than finding evidence of genetic defects or hereditary diseases that might explain the family's unusual characteristics, he was uncovering evidence that suggested they represented some form of evolutionary development that had progressed far beyond normal human parameters. Their physical anomalies were not symptoms of degeneration, but indicators of adaptation to environmental conditions or evolutionary pressures that he could not identify. The sensory capabilities of the Hollow family members provided particularly compelling evidence of their departure from normal human limitations. Dr. Callaway documented instances of visual acuity that exceeded anything he had previously observed, with family members demonstrating the ability to perceive fine details in near total darkness and to detect movement at distances that should have been beyond the range of normal human vision. Their hearing seemed equally enhanced, allowing them to respond to sounds that Dr. Callaway's instruments could barely detect, and to locate the sources of acoustic signals with precision that rivaled the abilities of wild animals. But it was their apparent capacity for communication without audible speech that truly challenged Dr. Callaway's understanding of human consciousness and social interaction. He documented numerous instances in which family members seemed to coordinate their activities and share information through mechanisms that he could not observe or measure, suggesting forms of telepathic or empathic connection that current scientific knowledge could not explain or even acknowledge as possible. Dr. Callaway's final journal entries, written in handwriting that became increasingly erratic and difficult to read, expressed growing concern about the implications of his research and the potential consequences of sharing his findings with the broader scientific community. He had begun to suspect that the Hollow family's unusual characteristics were not the result of random genetic variation, but were part of some deliberate process of transformation or evolution that served purposes he could not comprehend. His last recorded observation, dated October 31st, 1880, contained a single sentence that would haunt everyone who later read his journals. "I fear that I have discovered not what they are becoming, but what they have always been, and what we ourselves might become if we understood the true nature of the forces that shape human existence." After that date, Dr. Callaway's journals contained no further entries, and no trace of the distinguished physician was ever found in the pinewoods or anywhere else in Alabama. The disappearance of Dr. Callaway proved to be the final catalyst that transformed years of growing unease into decisive action among the residents of Millbrook. The loss of a respected professional, a man of science and standing who had approached the situation with rational methodology rather than superstitious fear, convinced even the most cautious members of the community that the Hollow family represented a threat that could no longer be tolerated through simple avoidance and whispered warnings. The decision to take direct action was not made lightly or quickly. For weeks after Dr. Callaway's disappearance, heated discussions took place in every home, church, and gathering place in Millbrook, with opinions ranging from those who advocated immediate violent confrontation to others who argued for involving state or federal authorities in what had clearly become a matter beyond local capability. But the isolation of the community and the difficulty of explaining the situation to outsiders who had not witnessed the accumulating evidence of the Hollow family's unnatural characteristics gradually pushed public opinion toward a more direct solution. The plan that eventually emerged from these discussions reflected both the frontier practicality of the Millbrook residents and their desperation to end a situation that had haunted their community for generations. A group of 23 men, representing nearly every family in the area, would approach the Hollow family's homestead under cover of darkness, surround the ramshackle buildings that housed the mysterious clan, and use fire to eliminate what they had come to view as an infestation that threatened the safety and sanity of every decent person in the region. The night chosen for the action was November 15, 1880, selected because the new moon would provide maximum darkness for the approach through the pine woods, while also corresponding to local folklore that suggested the Hollow family's supernatural abilities might be reduced during the darkest phase of the lunar cycle. The men assembled at sunset at the edge of the forest, armed with rifles, shotguns, and improvised weapons, but carrying primarily torches, lanterns, and containers of kerosene that would serve as the primary tools for their grim work. The approach through the pine woods proceeded according to plan, with the group moving in careful formation through terrain that most of them had never seen, but which they navigated using maps and directions provided by the few members who had ventured into the forest on hunting expeditions. The oppressive silence that characterized the deeper parts of the woods seemed even more pronounced than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the violence that was about to unfold in its depths. When the vigilantes reached the clearing where the Hollow family's building stood, they found the structures exactly as they had been described by previous visitors: ramshackle constructions of salvaged wood and improvised materials that seemed to sag under their own weight while somehow maintaining enough structural integrity to provide shelter for their unusual inhabitants. Dim light flickered through gaps in the walls and around the edges of crude shutters, suggesting that the family was present and active despite the late hour. The attack began with the systematic placement of combustible materials around the perimeter of each building, a process that took nearly an hour to complete as the men worked in careful coordination to ensure that no escape routes would remain available once the fires were lit. The kerosene-soaked rags and dry kindling were positioned to create a conflagration that would consume the entire homestead within minutes, leaving nothing that could survive the intense heat and flames. But it was when the first torches were applied to the prepared combustibles that the night took a turn that none of the vigilantes had anticipated, despite all their preparation and determination. The flames spread with the expected rapidity, engulfing the wooden structures in sheets of orange fire that should have been visible for miles across the flat landscape of the pine woods. But instead of the crackling roar that normally accompanied such intense combustion, the fire burned with an eerie silence that made the men's own breathing and heartbeats seem unnaturally loud in the surrounding darkness. More disturbing still was the response from within the burning buildings. Rather than the screams of terror or pain that the vigilantes had expected to hear from the trapped inhabitants, the night was filled with sounds that challenged every assumption they had made about the nature of the beings they were attempting to destroy. The voices that emerged from the flames were not human in any recognizable sense, producing harmonics and frequencies that seemed to resonate in the bones and organs of the listeners rather than simply reaching their ears. As the fires reached their peak intensity, shapes began to emerge from the burning structures that defied every expectation the men had formed about what they might encounter. The figures that moved through the flames showed no signs of being affected by the intense heat, walking calmly through fire that should have been immediately fatal to any living creature. Their silhouettes, backlit by the conflagration, revealed forms that were recognizably humanoid but possessed characteristics that no normal human should have displayed. Some of the emerging figures moved with a fluid grace that seemed to ignore the physical limitations of human joints and muscle structure, flowing through the space around the burning buildings like liquid taking temporary solid form. Others displayed bone structures that created silhouettes too tall or too angular to represent normal human anatomy, suggesting skeletal frameworks that had been modified by forces that the vigilantes could not understand or identify. Most terrifying of all were the sounds that accompanied the Hollow family's emergence from their burning homes. Not screams of pain or cries for mercy, but what could only be described as laughter, though it bore no resemblance to any expression of human emotion that the men had ever heard. The laughter seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously, creating harmonies and echoes that suggested the presence of far more individuals than should have been able to fit within the modest structures that were being consumed by the flames. The confrontation that the men of Millbrook had planned as a decisive resolution to their community's long-standing fear became instead a rout that scattered them through the pine woods in blind panic, each man racing through the darkness toward home and safety without any concern for the companions who might have fallen behind or become lost in the unfamiliar terrain. In the decades that followed the failed attempt to eliminate the Hollow family through violence, the story of Alabama's Pine Woods mystery began to attract the attention of a different kind of investigator. As the 20th century dawned and brought with it new scientific disciplines and methodologies, Researchers from universities and government institutions arrived in the region with theories and explanations that promised to illuminate what rural superstition had shrouded in darkness and fear. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a pioneering anthropologist from Harvard University, was among the first academics to conduct a systematic study of the Hollow family legend. Her 1923 monograph, Genetic Isolation and Cultural Devolution in Rural Alabama, proposed that the disturbing characteristics attributed to the pinewoods inhabitants could be explained through well-understood principles of population genetics and social psychology. According to Dr. Thornfield's analysis, generations of intermarriage within a small, isolated population would inevitably produce the kinds of physical deformities and behavioral abnormalities that local folklore had transformed into supernatural phenomena. The genetic explanation gained support from Dr. Richard Kellman, a physician and researcher who specialized in hereditary diseases and chromosomal abnormalities. Dr. Kellman's work with isolated populations in other parts of the American South had revealed numerous cases where consanguineous marriage practices had produced individuals with unusual physical characteristics and cognitive impairments that uninformed observers might interpret as evidence of supernatural influence. His published papers argued that the Hollow family represented a textbook example of genetic drift and inbreeding depression, conditions that were well documented in scientific literature and required no appeal to paranormal explanations. But the scientific consensus that began to emerge around these rational explanations faced significant challenges when researchers attempted to find physical evidence to support their theories. Multiple expeditions to the pinewoods, equipped with modern surveying equipment and guided by detailed maps derived from historical accounts, failed to locate any trace of the structures that witnesses had described in such vivid detail. The clearings where the Hollow family's homestead should have stood were overgrown with vegetation that appeared to have been undisturbed for decades, showing no signs of human habitation or recent construction activity. Archaeological investigations, led by Dr. James Morrison of the University of Alabama, attempted to resolve this discrepancy by conducting systematic excavations in areas where historical accounts placed the family's buildings. The dig sites were selected using the most precise location data available from surviving witness testimonies and historical documents. But months of careful archaeological work produced no artifacts, structural remains, or other physical evidence that any human settlement had ever existed in the pinewoods. Even more puzzling was the absence of human remains in areas where local folklore insisted that members of the Hollow family had been buried over the course of several generations. Ground-penetrating radar surveys and systematic soil sampling revealed no evidence of graves, burial sites, or human skeletal material, despite the fact that mortality rates in isolated frontier communities should have produced numerous interments. Over the decades during which the family was supposed to have occupied the area, the lack of physical evidence began to shift. Academic opinion toward psychological and sociological explanations for the persistent legends. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in mass hysteria and collective delusion, published influential research suggesting that the Hollow family story represented a classic example of community-wide psychogenic illness, a condition in which shared stress and isolation could produce remarkably consistent hallucinations and false memories across large groups of people. Dr. Chen's work documented similar cases from other isolated communities where economic hardship, social isolation, and environmental stress had produced elaborate collective fantasies involving supernatural threats or unusual human populations that existed only in the shared imagination of the affected community. Her analysis of the Millbrook situation identified numerous psychological and social factors that could have contributed to the development and persistence of the Hollow family legend, including the community's geographic isolation, economic instability, and limited access to education and outside information. But even the most comprehensive psychological explanations struggled to account for certain aspects of the historical record that seemed to resist rational interpretation. The disappearances of Dr. Callaway and other investigators were documented facts that required explanation, and while it was possible that these individuals had simply chosen to relocate without informing their colleagues or families, The pattern of vanishings associated with the pine woods exceeded what statistical analysis would predict for random occurrences. Similarly troubling was the persistence of the legend itself, which continued to influence the behavior of local residents long after the original witnesses had died and been replaced by new generations who had no direct experience with the phenomena that had terrorized their predecessors. Children born decades after the last reported sighting of hollow family members still avoided the pine woods and experienced nightmares involving pale figures and inhuman voices, suggesting that the psychological impact of the legend was being transmitted through mechanisms that purely rational explanations could not adequately address. The question that continued to haunt researchers was whether the absence of physical evidence proved that the hollow family had never existed, or whether it suggested that their existence had operated according to principles that conventional science was not equipped to detect or measure.